The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my chest. 89 years old, and I was finally sitting in that witness chair, my weathered hands gripping the wooden rail like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to earth. The lawyer asked me to state my name for the record, and when I opened my mouth, my voice cracked like old parchment. Eleanor May Thompson, I whispered, then cleared my throat and said it again, stronger this time. Eleanor May Thompson. After 63 years of marriage, I was about to tell the world what my husband really was. I looked across that room and saw him there, Harold, slumped in his chair, his once strong frame now bent with age, his eyes avoiding mine like they had for decades whenever I tried to speak up. His children, my stepchildren, sat behind him with their mouths hanging open. They'd called me crazy when I first spoke up. Called me a bitter old woman making up stories. But the bruises don't lie. The medical records don't lie. And at 89 I finally decided I was done lying too. The prosecutor had warned me this would be hard. She'd said, "Mrs. Thompson, are you sure you want to go through with this? You could just live quietly. You've made it this far. Live quietly." Those two words nearly made me laugh if laughing didn't hurt so much anymore. I'd been living quietly for 63 years. Living quietly while my bones healed in secret. Living quietly while I made excuses for black eyes and split lips. Living quietly while I told myself that maybe, somehow, I deserved it. But that morning when I woke up in that hospital bed for the third time in 6 months, something inside me finally broke open. Not my ribs this time, though those were cracked too. Something deeper. Something that had been buried under decades of shame and fear and the terrible, suffocating weight of keeping secrets. I was done being quiet. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell the court about the night of March 15th? I took a breath that rattled in my chest and began to speak. "If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. Before I tell you about that night, the night that changed everything, I need to take you back to who I was before. Before the fear. Before the silence. Before I learned that love could wear the mask of a monster. I was Eleanor May Sinclair then, 26 years old with victory rolls in my auburn hair and hope in my heart. It was 1960 and the world felt full of possibilities. I worked as a seamstress in downtown Detroit, my fingers dancing across silk and satin, creating beautiful things for beautiful occasions. Wedding dresses were my specialty, all that white lace and promise, all those young women spinning in front of my mirror with stars in their eyes. I believed in fairy tales then. I lived in a small apartment above Mrs. Kolsky's bakery, and every morning I'd wake to the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. The scent would drift up through the floorboards like a gentle kiss, pulling me from dreams that still felt possible then. I'd make my coffee, real coffee, not the chicory we'd had during the war, and sit by my window watching the city wake up below me. I had friends. Real friends. Mary Catherine from work who could make me laugh until my sides ached. Tom from the corner market, who'd save me the ripest peaches and call me Miss Sunshine. Mrs. Henderson from the floor below, who'd invite me for Sunday dinner and tell me stories about her late husband with such warmth that I believed marriage was something holy. I was happy then. I was whole. I remember the weight of my body differently in those days. I moved through the world without calculating distances to exits, without scanning faces for signs of anger, without that constant low-level hum of anxiety that would later become as natural as breathing. My laugh came easily. My sleep was peaceful. My future stretched out before me like a long, sun-drenched road. I believed in kindness. I believed that good people found each other, that love was patient and gentle, that a man who brought you flowers and opened doors was showing you the truth of his character. How was I supposed to know that some predators are gifted actors? The neighborhood where I lived was full of young couples just starting out, older folks who'd lived there for decades, children playing stickball in the streets until their mothers called them in for dinner. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where Mrs. Kowalski would refuse payment if she thought you were having a hard month, where neighbors sat on front stoops in the evenings, sharing stories and sweet tea. I felt safe there. I felt seen. I felt like I belonged. I had no idea I was about to disappear entirely. Harold Thompson walked into my life on a Thursday evening in October 1960, when the leaves were turning gold and the air carried that crisp promise of winter. I was closing up the shop, pulling down the window shade with Sinclair Alterations, painted in careful script, when I heard the bell above the door chime. "I'm sorry, we're closed," I called without turning around, still focused on organizing the pins scattered across my workbench. "I'm not here for alterations," came a deep voice, smooth as honey. "I'm here about the lady who makes them." When I turned around, he was leaning against the doorframe like he belonged there, hat tilted just so, a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums in his hand. He was handsome in that classic way, strong jawline, kind eyes, smile that seemed to light up the whole room. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he could protect you from anything. Later, I would learn that sometimes the thing you need protection from is standing right in front of you, holding flowers. "I'm Harold Thompson," he said, stepping into the shop. "I work down at the Ford plant. I've been walking past your window every day for 3 weeks, trying to work up the courage to come in." He had this way of looking at me, intense, focused, like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered. It made my cheeks burn in the most wonderful way. 3 weeks. I laughed, setting down my pins. "You could have just waved." "A woman like you deserves more than a wave," he said, holding out the flowers. "These are for you. No strings attached. I needed you to know that someone notices how hard you work, how kind you are to every customer who walks through that door. You've got light in you, Eleanor. It shines right through that window." He'd been watching me. I thought it was romantic. Harold courted me like something out of a movie. He brought me flowers every Friday, always chrysanthemums, he said, because they meant devotion. He took me to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, where he pulled out my chair and ordered for both of us because a gentleman should know what a lady needs. He drove me to the lake on Sunday afternoons, where we'd sit on a blanket and he'd tell me stories about his childhood on a farm outside the city. He was a widower, he told me. His first wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, along with their baby. He carried their photograph in his wallet and would sometimes get quiet, staring off into the distance with such profound sadness that my heart ached for him. I wanted to heal him. I wanted to love him back to life. He had 2 children from his first marriage, Robert, 14, and Susan, 12. They lived with his mother during the week and visited on weekends. Harold spoke about them with such tenderness, such devotion. He'd light up when he talked about teaching Robert to fish, about Susan's piano recitals, about the family he was trying to hold together despite his grief. "They need a mother," he told me one evening as we walked through the park, leaves crunching under our feet. "And I need someone to love again. Someone to build a life with." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Eleanor, you're everything I've been praying for. Kind, beautiful, patient. The way you listen when I talk about Margaret. Not many women would be that understanding about a man's past." I took it as a compliment. I thought empathy was what love looked like. The children were polite when I met them, if distant. Robert had his father's strong features but carried himself with a guardedness that seemed too old for 14. Susan was a beautiful girl with long dark hair and serious eyes, but she barely spoke during our first dinner together. When she did talk, it was only to answer Harold's direct questions, and even then her responses were careful, measured. "They're just shy," Harold explained later, walking me to my door. "They've been through so much. But they'll warm up to you. How could they not?" He was so sure, so confident in his ability to orchestrate our future. He painted pictures of the life we'd have. A house with a garden where I could grow vegetables, family dinners around a big wooden table, quiet evenings listening to the radio while Susan practiced piano and Robert did his homework. Sounded like everything I'd ever wanted. Harold's mother, Margaret Thompson Sr., named for his late wife, he explained, was a small, sharp-eyed woman who lived in a house that smelled of mothballs and disappointment. She looked me up and down during our first meeting like she was evaluating livestock. "So you're the seamstress," she said, not offering me a seat in her pristine living room. "Harold tells me you're nice." The way she said nice made it sound like a character flaw. "I try to be," I replied, attempting a smile. "Being nice isn't enough to run a household," she sniffed. "Those children need structure. Discipline. Harold's too soft-hearted for his own good, especially since Margaret passed. The children have been running wild." I should have asked what she meant by that. I should have asked a lot of questions. But Harold was so attentive, so devoted. He'd show up at my apartment with dinner when I'd had a long day at the shop. He'd rub my shoulders when I complained of aches from hunching over the sewing machine. He'd tell me I was beautiful when I felt plain, Interesting when I felt boring, perfect when I felt anything but. You're going to be so good for us, he'd whisper into my hair. You're going to make us whole again. I thought I was saving him. I didn't realize he was collecting me. The proposal came on Christmas Eve, 1960, with snow falling outside my apartment window and Bing Crosby crooning from the radio. Harold got down on one knee right there in my tiny living room, holding up a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Eleanor May Sinclair, he said, his voice thick with emotion, will you marry me? Will you help me build the family I've been dreaming of? I said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was small, just a few friends, his family, the pastor from his church. I wore a dress I'd made myself, ivory silk with pearl buttons I'd sewn on one by one. Harold looked so handsome in his dark suit, and when he said his vows, his voice cracked with what I thought was joy. I promise to love, honor and protect you, he said, his hands warm around mine. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. I believed every word. The first time Harold hit me, we'd been married exactly 6 weeks. I was in the kitchen of our new house, his house, really the one he'd shared with his first wife, trying to make dinner for the family. Susan sat at the kitchen table working on homework, and I was attempting to cook pot roast the way Margaret Sr. had insisted was the only proper way. But I'd never made pot roast before, and the instructions she'd given me were more criticism than guidance. The meat was tough. The vegetables were overcooked. When Harold came home from the plant, tired and covered in automotive grease, he took one bite and his whole demeanor changed. This isn't how Margaret made it, he said quietly, setting down his fork. I'm sorry, I said quickly, my stomach nodding. I followed your mother's recipe, but maybe Margaret had been making this dish for years. His voice was getting harder, colder. She knew how to take care of her family. Susan looked up from her homework and I caught something in her expression. A flicker of fear that made my chest tighten. I can try again tomorrow, I offered. Maybe if you showed me. Harold's fist slammed down on the table so hard the dishes jumped. Susan's pencil went flying. I shouldn't have to show you, he shouted, his face flushing red. A wife should know how to cook. Margaret never needed to be taught basic. That's when he backhanded me across the face. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side and pain exploded across my cheek. For a moment I couldn't process what had happened. The room seemed to tilt and there was a ringing in my ears that drowned out everything else. When the shock faded, I turned back to Harold, my hand pressed to my burning cheek, expecting, what? An apology? Horror at what he'd done? Something human? Instead, he was looking at me with disgusted disappointment, like I'd somehow forced him to hit me. Look what you made me do, he said, his voice eerily calm. I work all day to provide for this family and I come home to this. Margaret would be ashamed. I looked at Susan. She was staring down at her homework, her whole body rigid, like she was trying to disappear into the chair. Harold, I started, but he cut me off. Clean this up, he ordered, gesturing at the barely touched meal. And next time, maybe you'll think twice before serving garbage to your family. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my face on fire and my world crumbling around me. This was my husband. The man who'd brought me flowers and called me perfect. The man who'd promised to love and protect me. I told myself it was a mistake. A moment of stress and exhaustion. It would never happen again. But it did happen again. 2 weeks later, when I shrunk his favorite shirt in the wash. A month after that, when I accidentally broke one of Margaret's china plates. Each time it was my fault. Each time I had made him do it. And each time, Susan would go very still and quiet, like she'd learned to make herself invisible. I started to understand why. The hitting was just the beginning. Harold had subtler ways of keeping me in line, methods that left no visible marks but carved pieces out of my soul day by day. He started with isolation. You don't need to work anymore, he announced one evening about 3 months into our marriage. A husband should be able to provide for his wife. Besides, the children need you here. I'd loved my job. I'd loved the independence, the creativity, the friendships I'd built. When I protested, when I tried to explain that I wanted to keep working, that I wasn't ready to give up the shop, he got that cold look in his eyes. Are you saying I can't take care of my family? He asked quietly. Are you saying you don't trust me to provide? No, that's not. 'Cause that's what it sounds like. It sounds like you think I'm not man enough to support my wife. He twisted everything. made my independence into an insult against his masculinity. So I quit. I gave up the shop, the work that had made me feel capable and valued. I told myself it was temporary, that maybe in a few months when things settled down I could go back. I wouldn't work again for 43 years. Next came my friends. Mary Catherine would call, wanting to meet for coffee or see a movie, and Harold would intercept. "Eleanor's busy," he'd say into the phone while I stood right there, silently pleading with my eyes. "She has responsibilities now. Family obligations." When Tom from the corner market stopped by to check on me, I hadn't been in for weeks, Harold answered the door. "My wife doesn't need male friends," he told Tom, his voice friendly but his eyes ice cold. "I'm sure you understand." One by one the connections to my old life were severed. Mrs. Henderson invited me for Sunday dinner like she used to, but Harold said it wouldn't be appropriate. "We eat as a family on Sundays," he declared. "That's what married people do." When I tried to explain that Mrs. Henderson was lonely, that she'd been kind to me when I was single, he grabbed my wrist so hard I could feel the bones grinding together. "You're not single anymore," he hissed. "You belong to this family now. To me. Start acting like it." The bruises from his fingers lasted 2 weeks. The children became my only company, but even that relationship was carefully controlled. Harold monitored every conversation, every interaction. If I tried to be too affectionate with Susan, he'd accuse me of spoiling her. If I helped Robert with homework, I was undermining his independence. But worst of all was how they watched me. Susan especially. I'd catch her looking at me with this expression I couldn't read. Pity? Fear? Something darker? One day about 6 months into the marriage I found out why. I was cleaning Harold's dresser when I found the photographs hidden in the back of his sock drawer. Pictures of Margaret, his first wife. But not the lovely portrait he carried in his wallet. These were different. Margaret with a black eye. Margaret with her arm in a sling. Margaret with a split lip and terror in her eyes. He'd been hitting her too. My hands shook as I stared at those photographs, understanding flooding through me like ice water. This wasn't stress. This wasn't grief making him lash out. This was who Harold was. This was what he did to women. And those children, Robert and Susan, they'd lived through this before. They'd watched their mother endure what I was enduring. That's why Susan went so still when Harold got angry. That's why Robert seemed too old for his age. They'd been trained just like I was being trained. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly shoved the photographs back where I'd found them. When Harold appeared in the doorway, I was dusting his nightstand with trembling hands. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes watchful. "Just cleaning," I managed, not trusting myself to look at him. He studied me for a long moment and I felt like he could see right through me, could read the knowledge written across my face. "Good," he said finally. "Margaret always kept things tidy. I'm glad to see you're learning." The way he said her name, like a threat, like a warning, made my blood turn to ice. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how I'd ended up here. 6 months ago, I'd been Eleanor Sinclair, independent woman with a business and friends and a future that belonged to me. Now I was Mrs. Harold Thompson, prisoner in a house that smelled like another woman's fear. But it got worse. So much worse. The psychological abuse was relentless and creative. Harold would hide my things, my sewing supplies, my books, photographs of my family, then act concerned when I couldn't find them. "You seem to be getting forgetful, sweetheart," he'd say with false sympathy. "Maybe you should see a doctor. Memory problems can be serious." He was making me doubt my own mind. He'd rearrange furniture when I was out grocery shopping, then act confused when I mentioned it. "The couch has always been there, Eleanor. Are you feeling all right?" He'd tell me he'd mentioned dinner plans or appointments, then deny ever having the conversation when I prepared for them. "I never said that. You must have dreamed it." Slowly, steadily, he was erasing my sense of reality. The worst part was how he did it all with such care, such apparent concern for my well-being. To the outside world, Harold Thompson was a devoted husband worried about his wife's declining mental state. He'd mention my episodes to neighbors, to the mailman, to anyone who would listen. "She's been having some problems since we married," he'd say, shaking his head sadly. "The stress of becoming an instant mother, I think. Poor thing gets confused so easily now." He was building a case against my sanity, one conversation at a time. The violence escalated too. What had started as occasional slaps became systematic beatings, always carefully placed where clothing would hide the damage. Harold was methodical about it. He'd learned from experience with Margaret. Ribs, back, upper arms, thighs. Places that hurt but didn't show. I became an expert at makeup and strategic clothing choices. But it was the emotional torture that nearly broke me. Harold would describe in graphic detail all the ways I was failing as a wife and stepmother. How Margaret had been better at everything. Cooking, cleaning, child rearing, even intimacy. She understood what a man needed, he'd say while I lay curled up on the bathroom floor, ribs screaming from his latest lesson in proper behavior. She knew how to be grateful. I started to believe him. I started to think I deserved it. The children watched it all happen. Susan would find me sometimes crying in the laundry room or the basement, and she'd just stand there with that unreadable expression. Once she brought me a cold cloth for my face without saying a word. When I tried to thank her, she just shook her head and walked away. I think she was trying to save me in the only way she knew how. But she was just a child herself. Robert dealt with it differently. He started acting out at school, getting into fights, failing classes. Harold blamed me, of course. He's confused about his place in this family, he'd say, tightening his belt around his knuckles like he was planning to use it for more than holding up his pants. Maybe if his stepmother knew how to provide proper guidance. The belt was new. Margaret's pictures hadn't shown belt marks. I tried to leave exactly once, about 2 years into the marriage. I packed a small bag while Harold was at work and Susan was at school. I had $47 hidden in a coffee can, money I'd been squirreling away from grocery shopping, a few cents at a time. I made it to the bus station downtown. I was standing in line to buy a ticket back to Detroit, back to some vestige of my old life, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Harold's voice was pleasant, conversational. "There you are, sweetheart. I've been looking everywhere for you." The people around us smiled. What a devoted husband, tracking down his confused wife. How sweet that he'd come to collect her. No one saw the way his fingers dug into my shoulder like claws. "I think you're having one of your episodes again," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Remember what the doctor said about stress and confusion? Let's get you home where you'll be safe." He guided me out of that bus station like I was made of glass, like I was precious cargo that might break. The whole way to the car he kept up a steady stream of gentle concern. "I know it's hard, honey," he murmured. "All these big feelings, all this confusion. But running away isn't the answer. We'll get through this together." The beating I got that night put me in bed for a week. After that he never left me alone for more than an hour. If he had to go somewhere, he'd take me with him or arrange for his mother to visit. Margaret Sr. would sit in my living room like a prison guard, watching my every move with those sharp little eyes. "Harold's worried about you," she'd say. "He thinks you might hurt yourself. Or the children." They were building a narrative. Unstable wife. Dangerous woman. Someone who couldn't be trusted alone. Years blended together in a haze of pain and numbness. 1963, 1964, 1965. The world outside was changing. Civil rights, women's liberation, social revolution. But inside that house, time stood still. I was trapped in 1961, the year I'd said, "I do," and signed away my soul. I forgot what my laugh sounded like. I forgot what hope felt like. I forgot that I had ever been anyone other than Harold's broken wife. Susan grew up before my eyes, transforming from a guarded child into a young woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. The day she turned 18, she left for college and never came back. Not for holidays, not for summers, not even for quick visits. "She's ungrateful," Harold declared. "After everything I've done for her, everything I've sacrificed." But I understood. She'd escaped. She'd done what I couldn't do. Robert left too eventually. Joined the military the day he graduated high school. I never saw him again either. I was alone with Harold. Completely alone. The abuse continued for decades. Through my 30s, my 40s, my 50s. Harold retired from the plant but never retired from his hobby of making me suffer. If anything, having him home all day made things worse. More opportunities for criticism, more time to find fault with everything I did. I became a ghost in my own life. People in town saw us as the long-married couple. Harold and Eleanor Thompson, together for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. What devotion. What an example of commitment. If only they knew what commitment really looked like in that house. Harold aged, but his cruelty didn't. If anything, he got more creative with it. More psychological. He'd learned that broken bones healed, but a broken spirit could last forever. By the time I was in my 70s, I could barely remember the woman I'd been before. Eleanor Sinclair felt like someone I'd read about in a book, someone who'd lived a completely different life. I thought I would die in that house. I thought my bones would rest in that basement and no one would ever know the truth. But then Harold started getting sick. Harold's first stroke came on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, exactly 63 years after we'd been married. I found him collapsed in the bathroom, his face twisted, his left side unresponsive. Part of me, a dark, wounded part I tried to keep buried, hesitated before calling 911. For just a moment I wondered what would happen if I didn't make that call. But I did call. Because despite everything, despite decades of abuse and terror and suffocation, I couldn't let another person die while I watched. Even him. The stroke left Harold partially paralyzed and dependent on me for care. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd spent 6 decades controlling my every move now needed me to help him eat, dress, bathe. The predator had become prey. But even weakened, he was still dangerous. His voice was slurred now, but the venom in his words remained crystal clear. If anything, his physical helplessness made him more vicious, more determined to hurt me in whatever ways he still could. Useless, he'd slur when I helped him to the bathroom. Can't even do this right. Margaret would've. Always Margaret. Always comparing me to a dead woman who'd suffered the same hell I was living. The visiting nurses saw bruises on me sometimes. My wrists where he'd grabbed them, my arms where he'd pinched with those cruel fingers that still worked just fine. But I was 87 years old. Old people bruise easily, don't they? Who would suspect that a stroke victim could still be an abuser? Harold knew exactly what he was doing. He'd wait until we were alone, then find ways to hurt me that wouldn't show. Pinching the soft skin under my arms. Twisting the tender flesh of my inner thighs. Biting me when I leaned down to help him eat. You like this, he'd whisper, his words garbled but understandable. You like being needed. Makes you feel important. He was right and I hated him for it. I hated myself for it. The truth was, caring for Harold gave me purpose in a way I hadn't felt in decades. Not because I loved him, that had died so long ago I couldn't remember what it felt like. But because for the first time in our marriage I was the one with power. I controlled his medication schedule, his meals, his comfort. I could be slow getting to him when he called. I could forget to help him turn in bed to prevent bed sores. I could make his coffee too cold, his soup too salty. I wasn't proud of these small acts of revenge, but they kept me sane. Then came the night of March 15th, the night that changed everything. I'd been up for 3 straight days. Harold had developed pneumonia, and the doctor said he needed round-the-clock care or he'd have to go to the hospital. Harold had made it clear what he thought about that option. No hospitals, he'd wheezed, his eyes bright with fever and fury. You'll take care of me here. Like a good wife. Even dying, he was giving me orders. So I stayed awake. Monitored his breathing, checked his temperature, gave him medications every 4 hours. I dozed in the chair beside his bed, jerking awake every time he coughed or shifted. My body ached from the constant vigilance, but I didn't dare leave him alone. Not because I was worried about his health, because I was terrified of what he'd say I'd done if something happened while I was resting. He'd blame me for his death just like he'd blamed me for everything else. By the 3rd night I was hallucinating from exhaustion. Seeing shadows move in the corners of the room. Hearing voices that weren't there. My hands shook when I tried to give Harold his medicine and I spilled water on his blankets. Clumsy, he managed to say even with the fever. Always clumsy. That's when something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a rubber band stretched too far for too long. I stood up from the chair where I'd been keeping vigil and looked down at him. Really looked at him. Harold Thompson, the man who'd stolen my life, reduced to a wheezing, sweating shell of cruelty in a hospital bed I'd rented and positioned in our bedroom. Harold, I said quietly. His eyes focused on me with difficulty. The fever had made them glassy, but there was still that familiar meanness lurking behind them. What? I know what you did to Margaret. The words came out of my mouth before I'd even realized I was going to say them. 63 years of silence, broken in a single sentence. Harold's eyes sharpened despite the fever. For a moment he looked almost like his old self. Alert, dangerous, calculating. Don't know what you're talking about, he wheezed. The photographs, I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. The ones you kept in your dresser. I saw them. I've known for 60 years what kind of man you are. I waited for him to deny it. To call me crazy. To blame me for snooping. Instead, Harold started to laugh. A horrible wheezing sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he could speak again, his voice was clearer than it had been in weeks. So, he said. So what if you knew? What were you going to do about it? Leave me. He laughed again and the sound made my skin crawl. You're nothing without me, Eleanor. You've always been nothing. Just like Margaret was nothing. Just like every woman is nothing until a man gives her purpose. That's when I knew. I knew what I had to do. I walked over to his bedside table where his medications were lined up in careful rows. Painkillers for his arthritis. Blood thinners for his circulation. Heart medication to keep his damaged system functioning. Sleeping pills for when the pain got too bad. And insulin. Harold had developed diabetes 5 years earlier. I picked up the insulin pen, the one I'd been using to give him his evening dose. My hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in years. Eleanor, Harold said, and for the first time in decades, I heard something like fear in his voice. What are you doing? What I should have done 60 years ago. I loaded the pen with insulin. Not his usual dose, all of it. Every unit in the cartridge. You can't, he whispered, struggling to sit up against his pillows. You won't. You're too weak. Too scared. I was weak, I said, moving toward the bed. I was scared. But I'm not that woman anymore. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, the insulin pen in my lap. Harold's breathing was rapid now, panicked. Think about what you're doing, he gasped. This is murder. You'll go to prison. You'll die in prison. I considered this. 87 years old, facing life in prison for killing my abuser. It should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 6 decades. Peace. Maybe, I said. But I won't die as your victim. I reached for his arm, the one without the for his fluids. Harold tried to pull away, but his stroke-weakened body couldn't move fast enough. I held his wrist gently, more gently than he'd ever held mine, and positioned the needle against his skin. Please, he whispered, and it was the first time I'd ever heard him say that word. Please, Eleanor. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. 63 years too late. I know you are, I said softly. You're sorry you got caught. Sorry you're helpless. Sorry you can't hurt me anymore. But you're not sorry for what you did. You're not sorry for who you are. I pressed the pen against his arm and pushed the plunger. All of it. Every last unit. Harold's eyes went wide and he opened his mouth to scream. But I was ready for that. I'd prepared for this moment in ways I hadn't even realized until it was happening. I pressed my hand gently over his mouth. Not violently, not cruelly, just firmly. Shoo, I whispered, the way you'd soothe a frightened child. It's okay. It's going to be okay. It was the kindest thing I'd ever done for him. Harold's body went into insulin shock within minutes. His eyes rolled back, his breathing became shallow and rapid, and his skin turned cold and clammy. I stayed with him through all of it, holding his hand, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. He died the way Margaret should have died. Peacefully, without pain, with someone who cared about his suffering. When it was over, when Harold Thompson had taken his last breath, I sat in that chair beside our bed and waited for morning. I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel anything except a vast, echoing silence where 63 years of fear used to live. I was free. I called 911 at exactly 6:47 a.m. The dispatcher was kind, professional. She asked if I wanted to try CPR, and I explained that Harold had been sick for days, that he'd had multiple strokes, that his body had simply given up during the night. It was all true in a way. The paramedics who arrived were gentle with me. They could see I was an elderly woman who'd just lost her husband of 63 years. They offered condolences, asked about funeral arrangements, suggested I call family members for support. We're so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thompson, the younger one said as they prepared to take Harold's body away. 63 years of marriage. That's really something special. Yes, I agreed. It really was something. The funeral was small. Susan came back for it, the first time I'd seen her in 20 years. She looked successful, confident, free in a way I'd never been. Robert sent flowers but didn't attend. Harold's remaining relatives gathered to say nice things about a man they'd never really known. I stood beside the casket in my black dress, the same one I'd worn to Margaret Sr.'s funeral years earlier, and accepted sympathy from neighbors who thought they were comforting a grieving widow. I felt like I was at the funeral of my own captivity. Susan stayed for 3 days after the service. We didn't talk much, but there was an understanding between us that didn't require words. She'd escaped decades earlier. Now finally so had I. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked on the morning she was leaving. We were sitting in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Harold had first hit me all those years ago. "I think so," I said. And for the first time in my adult life I meant it. For 6 months I lived quietly in that house, learning how to be alone without being afraid. I threw away Harold's clothes, donated his furniture, painted over the dark colors he'd insisted on. I ate ice cream for breakfast when I wanted to. I stayed up late reading books he'd never let me buy. I took long hot baths without worrying about someone pounding on the door. I was discovering who Eleanor Thompson could be when she wasn't being systematically destroyed. But the guilt was eating at me. Not guilt about Harold, he'd gotten exactly what he deserved. Guilt about staying silent for so long. Guilt about all the other women who might have suffered because I'd never spoken up. I started thinking about Margaret. About those photographs hidden in the dresser. One evening in September I was going through Harold's papers when I found something that made my blood freeze. A journal hidden behind his tax records, filled with detailed accounts of every beating, every psychological torture, every moment of pain he'd inflicted over the decades. Not just on me. On Margaret too. And on other women, girlfriends before his first marriage, women he'd encountered over the years. Harold had been documenting his crimes like trophies, like a hunter keeping track of his kills. There were names, dates, descriptions that made me physically sick. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Harold was dead, but his victims deserved justice. His children deserved to know the truth about what they'd witnessed. The world deserved to know what kind of monster had walked among them for 86 years. I deserved to tell my story. The next morning I drove to the police station and asked to speak with a detective. When Officer Maria Santos sat down across from me in that small interview room, I took a breath and began with the hardest words I'd ever spoken. "I killed my husband. And I want to tell you why." The confession took 3 hours. I told her everything, about the abuse, about Margaret, about the journal, about that night in March when I'd finally said enough. Officer Santos listened without judgment, taking notes, asking gentle questions when she needed clarification. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Thompson," she said finally, "I need to ask you this directly. Are you confessing to murder?" I considered her question carefully. Was what I'd done murder? Legally, probably. Morally, I couldn't bring myself to think so. "I'm confessing to surviving," I said. The legal process that followed was complex. The district attorney's office had to decide whether to charge an 89-year-old woman with murder, even though the victim had been a documented abuser and I'd confessed voluntarily. Harold's journal, combined with medical records showing decades of suspicious injuries, painted a clear picture of what my life had been like. Public opinion was divided. Some people saw me as a hero, an elderly woman who'd finally stood up to her abuser. Others saw me as a murderer who should face the consequences of her actions regardless of the circumstances. The media attention was overwhelming, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about my 63-year marriage and what I should have done differently. I tried not to listen to any of it. The prosecutor, a young woman named Jennifer Chin, was sympathetic but firm. "I understand what you went through," she told me during one of our meetings. "But I can't ignore the fact that you deliberately killed another person. There have to be consequences." "I agree," I said. "But I've already paid the consequences. I paid them for 63 years. In the end, they charged me with voluntary manslaughter. My lawyer, a brilliant woman named Rebecca Walsh who took my case pro bono, argued for justifiable homicide, but the judge ruled that my actions didn't meet the legal standard for immediate self-defense. Which brought me to that courtroom, to that witness chair, to the moment when I finally told the world who Harold Thompson really was. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Prosecutor Chin presented her case methodically. I had planned Harold's death. I had administered a lethal dose of insulin. I had waited hours before calling for help. All true. But Rebecca told the rest of the story. She presented Harold's journal as evidence. She brought in experts on domestic abuse who explained the psychology of long-term victimization. She showed the court medical records documenting suspicious injuries going back decades. She called Susan as a witness, and my stepdaughter, brave, strong Susan, testified about what she'd witnessed as a child. "He was a monster," Susan said from the witness stand, her voice clear and unwavering. "And Eleanor was his victim for longer than I've been alive." The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they came back, the foreman, a middle-aged man who'd reminded me of my father, stood up and delivered a verdict that surprised everyone. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter, with a recommendation for the minimum sentence. But Judge Patricia Reeves had her own surprise. When she called me forward for sentencing, I prepared myself for prison. At 89, even a short sentence would likely be a death sentence. Instead, Judge Reeves looked at me with something like compassion. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "the law requires that I sentence you for the crime you've committed. However, the law also allows for judicial discretion in cases involving extraordinary circumstances." I held my breath. After reviewing all the evidence in this case, the documented abuse, the decades of suffering, the advanced age of the defendant, this court sentences you to time served plus 5 years probation. I was free. Actually, truly free. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others protested. Prosecutor Chin looked disappointed but not surprised. Rebecca grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. But all I could think about was Harold's journal and all those other names and how many women might finally get some measure of justice. That was 6 months ago. Now I live in a small apartment near the center of town, close enough to walk to the grocery store and the library. I have a garden on my balcony where I grow tomatoes and herbs. I volunteer at the women's shelter 3 days a week, helping other survivors navigate the legal system and find their voices. I'm learning how to be Eleanor again. Not Harold's Eleanor, not the broken version of myself I carried for 63 years. Just Eleanor. Sometimes I have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up in a panic thinking I'm back in that house, that Harold is calling for me from the bedroom. But then I remember, he's gone. He can't hurt me anymore. He can't hurt anyone anymore. I did that. I stopped him. The story isn't over. Harold's journal has led to reopened investigations into the deaths of 2 other women, Margaret and a girlfriend he'd had before his first marriage. There might be justice for them too finally. Susan and I talk on the phone every week now. Robert reached out through a lawyer. He's not ready to have a relationship, but he wanted me to know that he understands why I did what I did. That he's glad I survived. I'm still getting letters. From other survivors, from people who see something hopeful in my story. Some days I feel like a hero. Some days I feel like a murderer. Most days I feel like what I've always been. A woman who did what she had to do to survive. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. To every person who's ever felt trapped, who's ever believed they deserved the pain, who's ever thought their voice didn't matter. It does. You do. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard. Because silence is the predator's greatest weapon. And the only way to disarm them is to speak. You are stronger than you know. You are braver than you feel. And you are never, ever alone. Not anymore.